People always say that honesty sets you free, but nobody talks about what happens in the 5 seconds after you tell your best friend the truth and realize your entire life might never be the same again. The call started at 2:07 in the morning, somewhere between my fourth cheap beer and the terrible decision to stay at the party longer than I wanted to. My dorm room felt too small, too warm, and too quiet after hours of pretending to enjoy myself. Music still echoed faintly from the fraternity house across campus, carried by the cold October wind slipping through the cracked window above my desk. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my phone screen with the kind of courage that only exists when exhaustion and loneliness start to blur together. Noah's name glowed at the top of my contacts list, exactly where it had been for the last 10 years. Before I could think twice, I pressed call. He answered on the third ring. Ethan. His voice was thick with sleep, low and familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. Do you know what time it is? I glanced at the clock on my microwave and laughed quietly. Late enough for terrible decisions. There was a pause on the other end, followed by the rustling sound of sheets. You okay? That question. He had been asking me that same question since we were 12 years old, and I fell off my skateboard trying to impress older kids at the park. Noah Brooks had always known when something was wrong, even before I did. Yeah, I lied automatically. I don't know. I wanted to hear your voice. Silence settled between us, comfortable and dangerous at the same time. Outside, headlights swept across my ceiling as cars passed on the street below. I could picture him perfectly despite the 100 miles separating us. Dark hair sticking up in every direction, old college sweatshirt, probably rubbing sleep from his eyes while sitting in his apartment off campus. We had gone to different universities after high school, but distance had never changed us. At least, that was what I told myself. You sound weird, Noah finally said. Did something happen? I looked down at the half-empty can on my desk and swallowed hard. The truth sat at the back of my throat, heavier than anything I had ever tried to say out loud. For years, I had rehearsed different versions of this conversation in my head. Sometimes Noah smiled. Sometimes he laughed and told me he had known all along. Sometimes he walked away forever. But no matter how many times I imagined it, I could never force the words past my lips. Because Noah wasn't just my best friend. He was every summer afternoon spent at the lake near our hometown. Every Friday night football game. Every birthday cake. Every graduation photo. Every stupid inside joke that nobody else understood. He was the person who taught me how to drive and the first person I called when my parents divorced. Somewhere along the way, without permission and without warning, he had also become the person I compared everyone else to. I leaned back against the wall, squeezing my eyes shut as my heart pounded. Can I tell you something? I asked quietly. Noah didn't hesitate. You can tell me anything. I almost said it then. God, I almost did. Instead, I let out a shaky laugh and stared at the glow-in-the-dark stars that still clung to my dorm's ceiling from freshman year. Forget it, I muttered. It's stupid. Noah sighed softly. Ethan. The way he said my name made my chest ache. Whatever's going on, you don't have to figure it out alone. I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, I had spent years trying to figure it out alone. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending that the most important person in my world was only my friend. After we hung up, I did not sleep. I lay there in the darkness of my dorm room with my phone resting on my chest, replaying every word Noah and I had exchanged over the last 10 years, as if one of those conversations might explain why my heart always beat differently around him. Outside, the campus had finally gone quiet. The laughter from the fraternity houses had faded, replaced by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional gust of wind rattling the branches outside my window. I remember staring at the ceiling until sunrise painted the room pale blue, wondering how something that had once felt so simple had become impossibly complicated. The funny thing about growing up with someone is that you never notice the exact moment they become important to you. Noah had always been there. We met on the first day of third grade when I forgot my lunch and sat alone at the corner table in the cafeteria, trying not to cry in front of strangers. He walked over carrying a peanut butter sandwich and a bag of potato chips and asked if I liked superheroes. By recess, we had already decided we would become astronauts together. Back then, friendship seemed easy. It meant bike rides until the streetlights came on and sleepovers in his parents' basement where we stayed awake watching old movies we were probably too young to understand. It meant summers at Lake Greenwood, 30 miles outside our town, where Noah taught me how to skip rocks and laughed every time mine sank immediately to the bottom. He was fearless in ways I never was. He climbed the tallest trees, talked back to teachers, and signed up for football because he thought the uniforms looked cool. I was quieter. I preferred sketchbooks and library corners and pretending not to care when other kids called me shy. Somehow, none of that mattered to Noah. He pulled me into his world without ever asking me to become someone else. Looking back now, I wonder if that was when it started. Not all at once, not in some dramatic movie moment, but slowly, quietly, hidden inside ordinary memories. There was the afternoon sophomore year when we drove out to the lake after school and got caught in a thunderstorm. We sat in his truck eating gas station snacks while rain hammered the windshield, and Noah spent 2 hours talking about everything he wanted to do after graduation. He wanted to leave town, see New York, maybe California. I barely spoke the whole drive home because I kept thinking that wherever he went, I wanted to go too. Then there was prom. Noah went with Emma Parker, who had been in love with him since middle school. I remember helping him tie his tie in front of the mirror at his house while his mother took pictures downstairs. He kept joking about how uncomfortable dress shoes were, completely unaware that every time he smiled, something inside me twisted painfully. That night, I told myself I was jealous because he had more confidence than I did, because he seemed to move through life effortlessly while I struggled to understand myself. But deep down, I already knew the truth. By the time college came around, I had become an expert at hiding it. I dated girls occasionally because it seemed easier than explaining why I never felt what everyone else seemed to feel. I laughed at jokes I did not find funny and avoided questions about relationships whenever Noah brought them up. He never pushed. He just kept showing up, calling every few days, sending me pictures of terrible cafeteria food and complaining about his economics classes. And every time my phone lit up with his name, I felt both grateful and terrified, because I knew that eventually I would have to tell him the one thing I had spent years trying to outrun. November arrived faster than I expected, bringing cold mornings and the kind of gray skies that seemed permanent in northern Washington. Midterms swallowed most of my attention, and for a few weeks, life settled back into something that almost resembled normal. Almost. Noah and I still talked nearly every day, but ever since that late-night call, something had shifted inside me. It was subtle, impossible for anyone else to notice, but I felt it in every silence that lasted a second too long and every message I typed and deleted before finally pressing send. Then, one Thursday afternoon, everything became infinitely more complicated. I was sitting in the architecture studio, surrounded by half-finished models and empty coffee cups, when Noah called unexpectedly. I stepped outside into the crisp air, balancing my phone against my shoulder while I zipped up my jacket. The trees lining campus had turned shades of red and gold, their leaves swirling across the sidewalks in the wind. "You are never going to believe this," Noah said, sounding more excited than I had heard him in months. I smiled despite myself. That usually means you did something stupid. First of all, rude. Second, I met someone. The words hit me so suddenly that I almost missed the curb in front of me. For a moment, all I could hear was the distant sound of students laughing somewhere across campus and the dull pounding of my own heartbeat. I forced myself to laugh. "Oh, really? Yeah, her name is Claire. We met at a coffee shop near my apartment a couple of weeks ago." Her name settled in my chest like a stone. Claire. Suddenly, she existed everywhere in my imagination. Sitting across from him at dinner, walking beside him through the city, laughing at the same stupid jokes that had belonged to us for years. "That is great," I said, hating how rehearsed it sounded. "You like her?" Noah hesitated for a second, and when he answered, his voice carried an unfamiliar warmth. "I think I do." The conversation continued for another 15 minutes. He told me she was studying journalism and that she loved old movies and had somehow convinced him to try sushi for the first time. I responded when I was supposed to, asked questions when silence would have seemed suspicious, and somehow made it through the call without letting my voice crack. But the moment I hung up, something inside me collapsed. I spent the rest of the afternoon pretending to work while my mind replayed every detail Noah had shared. It was ridiculous, really. Noah had dated before. Girls had always liked him. He was funny and kind and effortlessly handsome in ways he never seemed to notice. None of this should have surprised me. Yet that night, lying awake in my dorm room, I realized I had been holding on to a fantasy without admitting it to myself. Some small, selfish part of me had always believed there would be more time. More summers, more late-night phone calls, more opportunities to figure out how to tell him the truth. But hearing him talk about Claire made something painfully clear. Life was moving forward whether I was ready or not. The next few weeks only made things worse. Noah mentioned her casually during our conversations, never noticing how quiet I became. Sometimes he would send me pictures from restaurants or tell me about movies they had watched together. I hated myself for feeling jealous. Claire had done nothing wrong. Noah had done nothing wrong. The only person carrying a secret into every conversation was me. One Friday evening, after staring at my phone for nearly an hour, I opened our old photo album from high school. There we were at 17, standing by Lake Greenwood with our arms around each other after winning some meaningless senior year competition. Noah was grinning at the camera while I looked at him instead. I had never noticed that before. Or maybe I had noticed and simply refused to admit what it meant. I traced the edge of the photograph with my thumb and understood, with a certainty that terrified me, that I could not keep living inside this half-truth forever. Sooner or later, I was going to have to tell Noah who I really was, even if it meant losing the most important person in my life. The decision, when it finally came, did not arrive in some dramatic moment of clarity. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday in late November while I was walking back to my dorm with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Noah had just sent me another picture of him and Claire at some holiday market downtown. They were standing beneath strings of white lights, smiling into the camera, while people bundled in winter coats drifted behind them. I stared at the image for a long time before locking my phone and slipping it into my pocket. By the time I reached my room, I knew I could not keep doing this to myself. 2 days later, I texted Noah and asked if he wanted to come home for the weekend. Our hometown sat almost exactly halfway between our colleges, and Thanksgiving break was only a week away anyway. He answered almost immediately. Absolutely. It has been too long since we got terrible burgers at Miller's. Reading that message made me smile despite the knot forming in my stomach. We had been going to Miller's Diner since high school. It was one of those places with faded red booths and waitresses who still called everyone honey. If there was ever a place to change the course of my life, somehow it felt fitting that it would happen there. The entire drive home on Friday afternoon felt surreal. Rain tapped against my windshield as I rehearsed conversations that dissolved before they even reached my lips. Sometimes, in my imagination, Noah interrupted me halfway through and told me nothing would change. Other times, he stood up and walked out without looking back. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, I had convinced myself to postpone the conversation at least a dozen times. But then Saturday came, and with it, Noah. He looked exactly the same as he always had, standing outside the diner in a dark jacket with his hands shoved into his pockets, except maybe a little older, a little more distant. He grinned when he saw me and wrapped me in a quick hug, and for one terrible second, I almost abandoned the entire plan. We spent the next hour talking about classes, professors, and how strange it felt to be home after months away. Noah told stories about his apartment and laughed about a disastrous attempt to cook dinner for Claire. I laughed too, though every mention of her tightened something inside my chest. Outside, the sky had turned the dull silver that always came before sunset. People passed by our booth carrying shopping bags and cups of hot chocolate, already preparing for the holidays. It should have been comforting. Instead, I felt like I was standing at the edge of something enormous. Noah must have noticed the change in my expression because eventually he leaned back and frowned. Okay, seriously, what is going on with you? I looked down at my untouched fries. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sounds of the diner faded into the background until all I could hear was my own breathing. There is something I have been trying to tell you, I said quietly. Noah's face softened immediately. You know you can tell me anything. The words landed differently this time. They were no longer comforting. They were terrifying. I stared out the window at the parking lot, watching raindrops slide down the glass. My hands trembled beneath the table, and suddenly every excuse I had ever made for staying silent felt meaningless. I am gay, I said. The sentence came out so softly that for a split second, I wondered if he had even heard me. But Noah had. I saw it in the way his expression changed, not into anger or disgust, but into something I could not immediately understand. Surprise, maybe. Confusion. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then stopped. The silence stretched between us, growing heavier with every passing second. I should have stopped there. I should have let him process it. Instead, years of fear and exhaustion spilled out before I could stop them. And the truth is, my voice cracked, and I forced myself to continue. The truth is that I think I have been in love with you for a long time. Noah stared at me across the table, completely motionless. The noise of the diner rushed back all at once, dishes clattering in the kitchen, people laughing somewhere near the entrance, a Christmas song playing softly overhead. But inside our booth, everything had gone quiet. Noah looked down at his hands, then back at me, and for the first time in 10 years, I had absolutely no idea what he was thinking. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. Noah sat across from me with his hands folded on the table, staring at a point somewhere between the salt shaker and his untouched burger. I wanted him to say something, anything, but the silence only grew heavier. My heart pounded so hard that it almost drowned out the Christmas music drifting through the diner. Finally, Noah looked up. His expression was unreadable. "Ethan, he began, then stopped himself. He rubbed a hand across his face and glanced toward the window, where the rain had started falling harder, streaking the glass in silver lines. I did not know. I let out a laugh that sounded strange even to me. Yeah, that is kind of the problem. He nodded slowly, but he still did not look at me. For years, I had imagined this conversation unfolding in 100 different ways. I had prepared myself for anger, disappointment, awkward questions, even rejection. What I had not prepared for was this. Noah looked lost, completely and utterly lost. "Why did you never tell me?" he asked quietly. I shrugged, trying to act calmer than I felt. "Because I was afraid." That was the simplest answer, though it barely scratched the surface. Afraid that he would stop calling. Afraid that every memory we shared would suddenly feel different to him. Afraid that the person who had been at the center of my life for more than a decade would walk away and never come back. Noah leaned back in the booth and exhaled slowly. I do not know what to say right now." The words landed harder than I expected. I nodded, forcing myself to smile. "You do not have to say anything." But the truth was, I desperately wanted him to say something. Tell me that we would be okay. Tell me that our friendship mattered more than this confession. Tell me that I had not just destroyed the most important relationship in my life. Instead, Noah reached for his jacket. "I think I need some time to think." The sentence was gentle, almost apologetic, but it still felt like the floor had disappeared beneath me. "Of course," I said, though my throat had tightened so much that the words barely came out. We stood up and walked outside together. The cold air hit me immediately, carrying the smell of rain and wet pavement. For years, saying goodbye to Noah had been effortless. We would joke about whose turn it was to drive next time or make plans for the following weekend. But standing in that parking lot, everything felt unfamiliar. Noah shoved his hands into his pockets and looked at me for a long moment. "I am sorry," he said. "I just was not expecting any of this." I nodded again because I had run out of things to say. He gave me a small smile, the kind people offer strangers when they do not know what else to do. And then he turned and walked toward his truck. I stood there long after his taillights disappeared into the rain. Over the next few days, I convinced myself that he simply needed time. We had known each other forever. One difficult conversation could not erase 10 years of friendship. That was what I kept telling myself, anyway. But then Thanksgiving came and went without a message. The text I sent on Sunday remained unread for hours before Noah finally replied with a single sentence. "Sorry, things have been busy." After that, the distance between us became impossible, unanswered. I tried to focus on classes and final exams, but everything reminded me of him. Walking past the coffee shop near campus where we used to study together during winter break. Hearing a song we both loved playing in the grocery store. Catching myself reaching for my phone whenever something funny happened, only to remember that I no longer knew what to say. By mid-December, the silence had become unbearable. Late one night, I opened our old photo album again. Picture after picture flashed across my screen. Birthdays, road trips, graduation. 10 years of memories compressed into tiny squares of light. I stopped on one photograph from senior year, taken at Lake Greenwood just before sunset. Noah had his arm around my shoulders, both of us laughing at something outside the frame. Looking at that picture, I realized something that hurt even more than rejection. I did not know whether I had lost the chance to be with the person I loved. I did not know whether I had lost my best friend forever. Christmas break ended, and January arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made the entire campus feel abandoned. Students shuffled between buildings with their heads down and their hands buried in their pockets, eager to escape the wind that swept across the sidewalks before disappearing into heated classrooms. I threw myself into my classes with a determination that bordered on desperation. If I stayed busy enough, maybe I would stop checking my phone every few minutes. Maybe I would stop wondering what Noah was doing or whether he ever thought about that afternoon at Miller's. But grief has a way of finding you in the quiet moments. It found me when I walked past the campus bookstore and saw a copy of the science fiction novel Noah had forced me to read senior year. It found me when I ordered too much food because I still instinctively calculated portions for 2 people. Most of all, it found me every night when my phone remained silent on the nightstand beside my bed. By February, I had accepted what I believed was the truth. Noah was gone. Not physically, of course. He was still out there somewhere, attending classes, drinking terrible coffee, living the life he had always planned for himself. But the version of Noah who called me after every exam and sent me pictures of ridiculous road signs had disappeared. I told myself that this was the risk I had taken when I finally confessed. I had known things might end this way. Knowing that did not make it hurt any less. Then, one Friday afternoon, something happened that I could not explain. I was leaving my final class of the week when my friend Sophie caught up with me outside the library. Sophie and I had met in freshman orientation, and over the years she had become one of the few people who could tell when I was pretending to be okay. She studied graphic design at another university 2 hours away from Noah's campus, and occasionally their social circles overlapped. "You look exhausted," she said, handing me a cup of coffee she had apparently bought for me. "Thank you for noticing my rapid decline." She laughed, but the smile faded when she looked at me more carefully. "Have you talked to Noah lately?" The question caught me off guard. I shook my head. "Not really." Sophie hesitated for a moment. "That is weird." I frowned. "Why?" She tucked her scarf tighter around her neck as students streamed past us. "Because I saw him a couple of weeks ago at Ryan's birthday party." My stomach tightened instantly. "Oh." She studied my face, clearly realizing she had stepped into dangerous territory. "I mean, we barely talked. But he asked how you were doing." I stared at her. "He did." She nodded slowly. "Actually, he asked about you more than once." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Snow from the previous night still covered the grass around the library, sparkling beneath the pale afternoon sun. "Did he say anything else?" I asked, trying to sound casual and failing completely. Sophie bit her lip as if deciding whether to continue. "Not exactly. But Ethan, he did not seem angry. Honestly, he seemed miserable." The words echoed in my head long after we said goodbye. Miserable. It was not the emotion I had expected. I had spent months imagining Noah moving on effortlessly while I replayed our last conversation over and over again. The possibility that he might be struggling too had never crossed my mind. That night, unable to concentrate on anything else, I opened social media for the first time in weeks and searched for his profile. Most of his recent posts were ordinary. Pictures from class, a basketball game, a blurry sunset from his apartment window. But one image stopped me cold. It had been posted 3 days earlier. Lake Greenwood, covered in winter fog. The same lake where we had spent countless summers growing up. There was no caption, only the photograph itself. I stared at it for a long time, remembering the day we took that picture after senior year, remembering every conversation we had ever had sitting on those old wooden docks. For the first time since Noah walked away from Miller's, a thought slipped quietly into my mind. Maybe his silence had not been indifference. Maybe I had misunderstood what that look on his face really meant. For the next week, I tried to ignore the photograph. I told myself it was meaningless, that people posted old places online all the time, especially when they were homesick or bored. But every time I opened my phone, my eyes drifted back to that image of Lake Greenwood covered in winter fog. There had always been something sacred about that place for Noah and me. It was where we celebrated birthdays, escaped family problems, and spent endless summer evenings talking about futures that still felt impossibly far away. By now, the lake had become more than a place. It was a collection of memories I had spent months trying to survive without. Then, on the first Saturday in March, everything changed. I had signed up to help supervise a volunteer event renovating hiking trails about 20 miles outside campus. It seemed like exactly the kind of distraction I needed. The weather forecast promised clear skies, but by noon, dark clouds had rolled over the mountains, bringing freezing rain and sharp gusts of wind. We spent hours hauling equipment and clearing debris before the organizers finally called it early. By then, my clothes were soaked through, and my hands had gone numb despite my gloves. As everyone packed up, I slipped on the muddy path leading back to the parking lot. It was not dramatic. Nothing serious happened. I twisted my ankle badly enough that walking became difficult, and one of the volunteers insisted on driving me to the nearest urgent care clinic to make sure nothing was broken. The waiting room smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee. I sat there with an ice pack balanced on my leg, scrolling mindlessly through old messages while rain battered the windows outside. The doctor eventually confirmed that it was only a sprain and handed me instructions to rest for a few days. I thanked him, collected my things, and stepped into the hallway toward the exit. That was when I saw him. At first, my brain refused to process what I was looking at. Noah stood near the reception desk wearing a dark jacket, his hair damp from the rain outside. For a moment, neither of us moved. I genuinely thought I was imagining him. Then his eyes met mine, and every thought in my head disappeared. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Noah looked as shocked as I felt. But beneath the surprise, there was something else in his expression. Relief. He shoved his hands into his pockets and glanced away before answering. "Sophie called me." I stared at him. "Sophie?" He nodded. "She heard you got hurt and thought someone should check on you." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Sophie knew exactly what she was doing. We stood there awkwardly for several seconds while people walked past us carrying umbrellas and paper cups of coffee. The silence between us felt different now, less like distance and more like unfinished business. "You drove all the way here?" I asked. His campus was nearly 90 miles away. Noah shrugged as though spending nearly 2 hours on the road in terrible weather was completely normal. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." The words hit me harder than they should have. For months, I had convinced myself that he no longer cared, that our friendship had become another casualty of my confession. Yet here he was, standing in front of me with rainwater still clinging to his jacket because someone had called and told him I needed help. We walked outside together beneath the gray sky. The rain had softened into a cold mist that blurred the parking lot lights. Noah slowed his pace to match mine as we crossed toward my car. "Ethan," he said quietly, stopping beside the passenger door. I looked up at him, suddenly aware of how long it had been since we had stood this close. He took a breath and ran a hand through his damp hair, the same nervous gesture he had made since we were kids. "I owe you an explanation." My heart began pounding so loudly that I could barely hear the rain anymore. Noah stared out at the empty parking lot for a moment before finally looking back at me. "I did not disappear because I was angry," he said. "And I definitely did not disappear because I hated you." He hesitated, searching for words that seemed difficult even for him to understand. "I left because after what you told me, I started questioning things that I had never questioned before." For a long moment, I just stared at him. Cars moved through the parking lot behind us, headlights cutting through the mist, but everything beyond Noah's face seemed strangely distant. He leaned against my car and let out a quiet breath, as though he had been carrying these words for months and still was not sure how to say them. "I know it probably looked like I stopped caring," he said, his eyes fixed on the wet pavement. "But after that day at Miller's, I could not think straight." I crossed my arms against the cold, partly because of the weather and partly because my hands had started shaking again. "You did a pretty good job of disappearing." Noah nodded, accepting the accusation without argument. "I know." He rubbed the back of his neck and laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "Claire broke up with me 2 weeks after you told me." I blinked in surprise. "What?" She said I seemed distracted all the time. He shrugged. She was right. Rainwater dripped from the edge of the hospital awning as we stood there, both of us trying to make sense of a conversation that should have happened months ago. Noah looked exhausted, not physically, but in the way people do after carrying around questions they are afraid to answer. At first, I thought I was confused because I did not want to lose you, he admitted. "You have been my best friend for half my life." I kept telling myself that was all it was. He glanced up at me then, and there was something vulnerable in his expression that I had never seen before. But the more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. I said nothing. I was afraid that if I interrupted him, the moment would disappear. Noah shoved his hands deeper into his pockets and continued. Do you remember that summer after graduation when we drove out to the lake almost every night? Of course I remembered. We had spent weeks sitting on the dock, talking about college and pretending we were not terrified of growing up. I kept thinking about little things like that, he said quietly. And suddenly, memories that had always seemed normal did not feel normal anymore. He laughed under his breath. I started wondering why I got jealous whenever you talked about dating someone. Why I hated every guy who flirted with you at parties, even though I could never explain why. Why, no matter where I was or who I was with, you were always the first person I wanted to call. My chest tightened so painfully that I had to look away. For months, I had imagined every possible explanation for Noah's silence, but none of them sounded like this. So why did you not tell me? I asked. Why wait until now? Noah looked out across the parking lot for a moment before answering. Because I was scared. The words caught me off guard. He smiled sadly. Funny, right? You spent years being afraid to tell me the truth, and then I spent months being afraid that maybe I already knew mine. Neither of us spoke after that. The rain had almost stopped, leaving only the sound of water dripping from nearby trees. Somewhere in the distance, an ambulance siren echoed briefly before fading into silence. Noah took a small step closer. The worst part was realizing that when you told me how you felt, my first reaction was not to think about what everyone else would say or whether things would change. He hesitated, his voice softer now. My first reaction was panic because I realized I might feel something too. I looked at him, searching for any sign that I had. Misunderstood, but there was none. For the first time since that afternoon at Miller's, Noah was looking directly at me, without confusion or hesitation. I do not know exactly what this means yet, he admitted. I do not have everything figured out. But I know that losing you these last few months felt worse than anything I have ever experienced. He shook his head and laughed quietly at himself. And somewhere along the way, I think I finally understood why. The space between us suddenly felt much smaller than it had a few minutes earlier. My ankle still hurt, my clothes were still damp from the rain, and neither of us had any idea what came next. But standing there beneath the gray March sky, listening to Noah say the words I had stopped hoping to hear, I realized that maybe this was not the end of our story after all. Maybe it was simply the first time we were both brave enough to tell the truth. 6 months later, the photograph from Lake Greenwood sat in a simple wooden frame on the bookshelf in our apartment. Noah had found it in a box at his parents' house while packing for his move, tucked between old report cards and faded birthday cards from elementary school. In the picture, we were both 17, standing on the dock with the late summer sun behind us. He still laughed every time he looked at it because, according to him, his haircut had been a disaster. I still looked at it because it reminded me how much can change without anyone noticing. Spring had turned into summer, and somehow, somewhere between late-night phone calls and weekend visits, we had stopped being afraid of what came next. It had not happened all at once. There was no dramatic moment when everything suddenly made sense. The truth was much messier than that. After the conversation outside the clinic, Noah and I spent weeks learning how to talk to each other again. We started with small things. Coffee after class whenever our schedules allowed. Long drives with the windows down and music playing quietly in the background. Hours spent walking around the city, discussing everything from childhood memories to our plans after graduation. Some days felt easy, almost familiar. Other days felt awkward, as though we were trying to navigate a friendship we no longer fully understood. But for the first time in months, we were trying together. Noah graduated in May with a degree in economics. I finished my architecture program 3 weeks later. On the morning of my graduation, I spotted him in the crowd before the ceremony even began. He stood beside my parents, waving enthusiastically despite the fact that I was only 20 feet away. My mother rolled her eyes and told him to sit down. He ignored her completely. Later that evening, we drove back to Lake Greenwood. The weather was warm, and the air smelled like pine trees and sunscreen, exactly the way it had every summer since we were children. We sat at the end of the dock with our shoes kicked off, watching the sunset reflect across the water. Do you ever think about how close we came to ruining all of this? I asked quietly. Noah was silent for a moment. Honestly, he said, tossing a pebble into the lake. I think we came close to ruining it by pretending nothing had changed. I turned to look at him. You really believe that? He smiled and shrugged. I spent years thinking that loving someone was supposed to feel obvious. Like there would be some giant sign telling me exactly who I was supposed to be and what I was supposed to want. He glanced out at the water, where the last rays of sunlight shimmered against the waves. Turns out, it was just the person who had been sitting next to me all along. I laughed quietly, partly because it sounded like something from one of the old movies we used to watch and partly because hearing him say things like that still felt surreal. A month later, we moved into a small apartment in Seattle. It was nothing extraordinary. The kitchen was too small, the floors creaked, and the neighbors upstairs seemed determined to rearrange furniture at midnight every weekend. But it was ours. Noah found a job at a financial consulting firm downtown, while I started working for an architecture company a few blocks away. Life became filled with ordinary things. Grocery lists stuck to the refrigerator, arguments about whose turn it was to do laundry, and lazy Sunday. Mornings when we drank coffee by the window and watched the city wake up below us. Sometimes, I still think about that night in my dorm room when I almost hung up before Noah answered the phone. I think about all the years I spent believing that honesty would destroy the most important relationship in my life. And maybe, in some ways, it did. The friendship we had as children no longer exists. We left it behind somewhere between late-night confessions and rainy parking lots and all the difficult conversations that followed. But in its place, we built something stronger, something honest. Looking back now, I realized that the hardest part was never admitting who I was. The hardest part was believing that someone could know the truth and still choose to stay. And every morning, when I wake up and see that old photograph sitting on the bookshelf across the room, I remember that sometimes the people who change your life the most are the ones who have been there from the very beginning.